Welcome to Thoughtful Thursday here at Wisdom in the Word. We're glad that you're joining us. We're looking forward today to answering one of our listeners' questions. Just very quick before we jump into our study today, just a reminder on what is happening this weekend, Anniversary Sunday. And we are excited about being able to celebrate the church's 30th anniversary. Way back in 1992, God put it on the heart of Pastor Johnson to start this work, and we are grateful to have a continuing ministry here of influence in this particular area. And so we want to invite you to have someone with you to join us Saturday night, 5 o'clock, Singspiration, Sunday morning, 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, afternoon service, concert with Calvary Quartet. You've heard it all. And so we hope that you will plan to be with us. It's going to be an exciting weekend, and we're looking forward to being able to spend that time together as we continue to do God's work. And so we're looking forward to the great weekend the Lord has given us, as well as other events. But today we're on Thoughtful Thursday. We're back answering your questions. If you have questions, we want to encourage you to be able to send those to us. You can send those to us at the following email address, podcast.watw@gmail.com. podcast.watw@gmail.com. You can get us your questions sent directly to us. We'll take them and add them to the list. Now today we are answering one of our listeners' questions. We'll get to that here in just a moment. We're going to take just a brief break and then we're going to jump in. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, make sure to comment down below, sign in, share this out with somebody else, and that little share button, share that out and encourage somebody else to study the Bible with us, and perhaps they might have some questions that they would like answered as well. Let's take that break, and then we'll jump in with the audio version of our Thoughtful Thursday. Welcome to Wisdom in the Word. This is Thoughtful Thursday, and we're glad that you're joining us today. Every Thursday, we gather together and we answer questions from our listeners. And today, we are taking just a few minutes to answer one question from one of our listeners. I'll read it, and then we'll get into the answer. Here's our question. How do you walk the fine line between the Great Commission of sharing the gospel with the whole world and not throwing pearls before swine? Is it ever right to just shake the dust off of your feet and move on to more fertile ground? I think there's a lot to unpack here, and there's some phrases that are used that I think we need to also define. And so let's define some of those phrases, and let's try to understand what our listener is trying to ask us here. First off, how do you walk the fine line between the Great Commission? Now, what is the Great Commission? The Great Commission is found in Matthew 28. It is the commission that was given to the apostles who were comprising that early first church, of the responsibility to go and preach the gospel to every creature, to baptize them in the name of Christ, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and then to teach them to observe everything that Christ has given them to observe. That is, to make disciples. The overriding concept there is make disciples, and this is how disciples are made. And so we understand the responsibility that we have. That's the Great Commission. And so it says, how do you walk the line between the Great Commission of sharing the gospel with the whole world and not throwing pearls before swine? Now, that concept of throwing pearls before swine comes from Matthew chapter number 7 in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus actually uses this phrase in Matthew chapter 7 and verse number 6. He would say, "Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you." And the thought understanding here is the pearl before a swine is something precious, before something that's going to mistreat it. And again, the understanding of most scholars and most readers of the Bible is that this is referring to giving Christ, or giving the message of Christ, to people who are opposed to it adamantly and hostile towards it, and that we ought to be careful about continually and repetitively going back and casting our pearls before swine. And then they ask this question, is it ever right to just shake the dust off of your feet? Now, the concept of shaking the dust off of our feet comes from Matthew 10 and verse number 14. In Matthew 10 and verse number 14, Jesus would say this, "And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words when you depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet." And so what they're asking here, is it ever right just to shake the dust off our feet, move on to fertile ground? That is, what if somebody is hearing our message, hearing the gospel, and they refuse to accept it, and they don't want to understand what we have to say? They don't want anything to do with Jesus. And so is it ever right to be able to just shake our dust off? And when do we do that? At what point do we just simply say we're leaving people with God, with the Lord, and we're just going to let him deal with you because you obviously won't listen to us? I think that's the question here that's being asked. Now, I think to understand this better, we need a little bit of context, because the context of Matthew chapter number 10 of shaking the dust off is a little bit different than the Great Commission. In fact, in Matthew 10, what we really see is we see a commission that Jesus gives, but it's a commission not to the whole world. It's a commission only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And this particular commission that he gives here is to be able to take the message of the kingdom to them, to see which of them would be open to receiving Christ as their king. And the basis of that is not only going to be whether they receive the message, but how they receive the apostles. And if they're not willing to receive the apostles and receive them hospitably, and they treat them despicably, then Jesus tells them that specifically with the lost sheep of Israel, to shake the dust off of their feet and move on. Now, again, that phrase is not used when Jesus gives the Great Commission. He doesn't talk about shaking the dust off of our feet. And so we've got to talk about whether or not this is limited, and how this would be limited, and what this understanding of it was. What does it mean to shake the dust off of our feet? Now, with this, there are several things that we've got to understand. This appears four verses in the Bible, 4 times. Once in Matthew, once in Mark, and twice in the Gospel of Luke. All right. So in Matthew 10 and verse 14, we find it. Mark 6 and verse number 11, we find it. Luke 9 and verse 5, we find it. And in Luke 10 and verse number 11, we find it. Now, in all 4 of these verses, Jesus is sending his disciples out, and he's commissioning them, but it's not the Great Commission. And maybe we could call it the Lesser Commission, right? He's giving it to specifically, if it's not great, it's less. So the Lesser Commission was given so that they might be able to reach the house of Israel. And it stands in contrast with the Great Commission. You can read about the Great Commission in Matthew 28, 16 to 20, Mark 16, 14 to 20, and Luke 24, 44 to 49. So in the Great Commission, Jesus sends his disciples to proclaim the good news to all people, to preach the gospel. But in this Lesser Commission, it's limited only to the Israelites, only to those who are of the house of Israel. Now, this was a special mission. And if you read Matthew 10, you find out this is a special mission. The disciples weren't to take any of their supplies with them, because the Jews were supposed to supply that hospitality. They were supposed to take care of their own brethren. And that would help determine, based on that, how they would receive them would help determine whether or not they were open to the message that was being preached to them. And so he says to them, if you go to the Mark 6 passage, in Mark 6, 10 and 11, Jesus shares this thought. He would say to them here about this, he would say, and he said unto them, in what place soever ye enter into an house, there abide till ye depart from that place. And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear you, when ye depart hence, shake off the dust under your feet for a testimony against them. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Okay? So this Lesser Commission was never intended to be Jesus' final instructions. It was not given in the end of his ministry. It wasn't always about spreading the good news. It was a very specific part and limited in his earthly ministry. So we got to understand the significance of this. What was this about, right? Well, understand this phrase, shaking the dust off of their feet. This was a phrase that was used. In fact, it's going to be used later on. We'll talk about it in just a little while. Shaking the dust off their feet was not simply a way of saying it's time to move on. And I think that's the way our question is being phrased, like, well, when do we just move on? Well, that's not what just shaking the dust off of your feet meant, right? We saw it here in Mark 6 and verse number 11. He's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. He's dealing with judgment, right? So again, this was an official declaration. To shake the dust off of your feet was to say that this family or this town is marked for judgment. This family or this town is unworthy. They're not willing. Nobody here is willing to be able to receive it. So again, outside of this lesser commission, the only other example we have of shaking the dust off of our feet is against Jewish communities who rejected Paul's preaching. That is, it is found in Acts 13 and verse number 51, but once again, it's used only in reference to the Jewish people who rejected Paul. Acts 13, and they rejected the message of Christ. Acts 13 and verse number 51, Acts 13 and verse number 51. Here the Bible says, but they shook off the dust of their feet against them and came unto Iconium. And notice verse 50, right? But the Jews stirred up the devout and honorable women and the chief men of the city and raised persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them out of their coasts. So it really seems that this phrase, shaking the dust off of, was almost limited to cities, not to people, and whole cities that had rejected, most specifically places where the Jews had rejected Christ or rejected the Christ as their king. So again, this was a way of marking it. Again, I don't know if you've ever seen a forest where trees are marked for removal. That is, someone is tasked with locating those trees and then marking them to be cut down. And that's similar to the task that Jesus gave his disciples back in the Gospels. If the disciples had to shake a town's dust off their feet, Jesus said it was going to be more tolerable for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah than that town, right? So I don't know if we realize this when we say, well, when should I shake the dust off of my feet? We're essentially saying, when can I mark these people for condemnation? Right? When can I mark this city for condemnation? That is, we shouldn't be eager to do this. I think that's the point. The point is, because this involves such great judgment, we shouldn't be eager about it. Now, we understand the bigger picture, right? Let's get that. Jesus told us a parable that could really help us understand what it means to shake the dust off of our feet. Jesus said the kingdom of God is like a wedding feast that many people are invited to. And he tells the story in Matthew chapter number 22. Now, in verse number 3, he tells us that they were that the people who were bidden to the wedding would not come. Right? And then the master sends servants to invite them to come. In verse 4, again, he sent forth other servants, tell them which are bidden, behold, I have prepared my dinner. Right? He tells them all about it. Come to the wedding feast. And what do they do? Well, in verse number 5, they made light of it, went their ways. They just ignored it. They ignored the invitation. And ultimately, in verse number 6, they took the servants and they treated them wrongfully, and they slew them. They killed them. So again, in this concept of this lesser commission, Jesus tells his disciples to shake the dust off their feet. It's equivalent to the first part of Jesus' parable. Jesus' servants took the wedding feast invitation to those who were first invited, the Jewish people. Those people that were first invited were the Jews. Only after their initial rejection could the invitation be taken to the whole world. That is, God has to fill his wedding feast, so he's going to open the door to other people. And in this passage, he does that. So again, Paul wrote about this at length in the book of Romans. He said that the good news, he said that the gospel was for the Jew first and also for the Greek. All right, the nation of Israel collectively rejected the invitation of Jesus, which means that reconciliation can be opened up to the rest of the world. So again, we understand this. Now that we understand a little bit about what was being said, we understand we shouldn't be eager to do it, and we understand that it was used really in reference to judgment and to the Jews who were rejecting Christ. Let's make an application, right? So as modern believers, right, we don't operate under the lesser commission. We operate by the Great Commission, right? And we can be thankful that that early Jewish world didn't receive, because it's only through their rejection that we, the gospel, is made open to us, those of us who are Gentiles. And today, both Jews and Gentiles can accept the invitation to receive Christ and be brought into Abraham's family, be brought into relationship with God. In Romans 11, we're grafted in. And so now that we're living in the era of the Great Commission, there's really no instruction to shake the dust off of our feet, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we can't do it, because later on Paul is going to do it. But again, Paul's going to do it with Jewish people. So it may seem that there's a limitation to this matter of shaking the dust off the feet. That is, God has, in this dispensation, in this time, he wants us to be as very patient as we possibly can with people. He wants us to be as willing as we can to be able to share Christ. Now, does there come time when there's a matter of hostility, when someone is hostile towards the gospel, where we would say, I'm just going to leave them in the Lord's hands. I'm going to pray for their souls. Yes, but I mean, we don't completely and totally abandon. I mean, we even still pray for them. We might even write them a note. We might even send them a gift at holiday seasons and put a tract in there or a gospel book to be able to witness to them. So I think now is the time to be inviting, to be pleading with people to come to the wedding feast. That's the time. We're supposed to go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in. But let me say this practically. Practically speaking, there may be a time when a particular person isn't ready to accept the gospel invitation. And in those times, it makes sense to try again later, or try a different approach, or allow someone else to try. But there's a big difference between these approaches and shaking the dust off of our feet. Shaking the dust is equivalent to condemnation, to bringing judgment. And I'm not sure that that's how the Lord would have us to act today. Now, again, looking at Matthew 7:6 with this pearls before swine, if it comes to a place where you're receiving hostility, if it comes to the place where it's obvious they're not interested in the gospel message, then it probably would be good to be able to just take that, put it to the side, commit to pray for them, maybe not to talk to them about the gospel anymore, pray that the Lord sends somebody else to them. But it's not a completely and totally give up situation where we just give up on the whole thing and we stop praying. But we know that God can work and God will work. And so we continue to invite them and to compel them. Even in Acts 13 and verse number 51, it seems that the Jews were the ones that were more recipients of Paul's indication of judgment marking that particular place because of the way that they responded. But if you go back and read that passage, you find that Gentiles in Acts 13 did respond to the gospel. I believe they were in Antioch in Pisidia. And so that's really kind of my thought there. So, I mean, does there ever come a time when we stop sharing the gospel? I would say perhaps to be able to pray for them, to ask the Lord to send somebody else, to maybe try other ways and avenues, keep conversation open. Yes, not continue to cast our pearls before swine. Yes, yes, yes. But the concept of shaking our dust off of our feet may be used in condemnation and exclusively in the Bible in relationship to the Jews. And that's a very particular application that we need to be aware of. Well, if you have questions today that you'd like to send to us here at Wisdom in the Word that you'd like to have answered, we want to encourage you to email us. Email us at podcast.watw@gmail.com. Podcast.watw@gmail.com. And those will come directly to us so that we can add them to the list. We want to thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us the next time. Submit your questions and join us on Tuesday as we conclude our study in the book of Hebrews on Tune Up Tuesday. Have a great rest of your day, and God bless.